I guess what separates this show from a lot of the other ones for me is how they were also able to gain some insight and show us a little bit about not only what was Michael Jordan like, what were they like when they were at the top, they also show us a little bit what were they like when they were getting to the top. So in other words, how did they get there? That's why I like this show so much. So I'll try to be concise with my analysis, and I'll try to focus on a few things that are not so obvious maybe, and also maybe a little bit controversial with this TV show. Because I mean, again, there's so many things you could go into. I'll try to focus on what I found a little bit juicy, maybe a little bit controversial in terms of how we usually do things with athletes when we work as coaches or when we are in some way as a parent, whatever, dealing with athletes. So yeah, here goes. And I want to give it a framework to begin with. When I work on the mental game, I like to have a framework that I call the 4 C's. I don't know about you guys, but to me the mental side is really complex. There's a lot of factors you could talk about. I mean, you have focus, confidence, motivation, and just to keep it straight in my mind, I like to have a sort of framework where I can place the different factors so I know what I'm talking about. And I use one option. I'm not saying it's the model you can use, but it gives at least me a framework so I can understand high-level performance. So if you want to succeed, if you want to become really good at something, you should probably have a high level of these 4 characteristics. And I mean, the most important thing if you want to become good at something is commitment. The ability to hang in there and not give up, especially when things get difficult. And this is something I think Michael Jordan has shown in abundance. I'll go into that. Second of all, you should like a challenge because things are not going to get easy. They're not going to be easy if you want to go to the top. And also, this is just generally good in life. I mean, these are the kinds of things you should maybe try to develop in yourself and your athletes. So challenge is a good thing. Control, the ability to take responsibility for yourself and to focus on the things that you can do something with, the focus that you can control is what you're looking for. So that becomes really important under pressure. We'll analyze that for Michael Jordan and some of the other guys. So the last thing would be confidence. If you want to perform under pressure, you're better off if you have a belief in yourself. And by that I mean believing in your abilities, not your general being, whatever. Belief in your ability to do good things when you perform. So that's the framework, and let's just dive in. That's the source. It's one of the more famous models. It's getting old. I mean, there's a ton of new models now, but this is still a thing that's being used because I think it's a useful framework. So let's just start with the most important factor, commitment. And again, I'll start with what I think is a little bit controversial, because when we talk about commitment, at least here in Norway, where I live, and we talk about a committed athlete, a performer who's committed, we like to think of certain things. We like to picture an athlete who's professional, dedicated, kind of serious, hardworking, internally motivated. And I mean, here's an example. Martin Ødegaard plays for Real Madrid, one of the top football for the Canadians in attendance. That would be soccer. Top team in Europe. He's just a school example of what we're looking for and what we like to think of as a committed athlete. I mean, he's such a good example of work ethic, professionalism, all those good things. And he's also very charming. So he's a favorite. And the way we think that we're going to produce these athletes is through a good, solid upbringing with tons of comfort and security, so that the athlete can grow up and feel secure and go out and explore. So this is kind of the model. So how does this hold up in the show? Well, not great. I mean, you have Michael Jordan smoking a cigar, having a beer after a game. I mean, let's not even go into this guy. I mean, these are partiers. I mean, they don't really hold up to the way we like to think of professionalism and stuff. So that's the first thing I wanted to tackle was, like, how do we deal with this? Let's say if an athlete thinks, well, are they really professional? I mean, how did they get so great when they behave like that? If you're a coach, like, what do you tell athletes if they ask you this question? I think it's a good question, and one that I've thought of in my mind as well. So the first thing one way I would reply to this would be try to distinguish between a couple of things. Because again, it's very common to have insight into what do they look like when they're at the top. Okay, sure, Michael Jordan, Denis Rodman didn't always do the right things all the time when they got to such a high level, but look at what they were like when they were young. So I just included a few terms, like the formative stage, like when they develop as young athletes, what are they like then? And if you have a look, I mean, they're so dedicated and they've spent so much effort when they were young. I mean, one baseball coach in the show says, Michael Jordan, the best work ethic he had ever seen. My favorite clip, probably in the whole show, that I love to show to young athletes is, I think halfway through the first episode, you have an incident where Michael Jordan walked into his team having a party. And he just left. And he tells us what he would do at that stage. He said, I wouldn't go into the clubs. I don't smoke. I don't do lines. I didn't drink at the time. I was looking to just get some rest, get up, and go play. Of course, as he's saying that, he's holding a drink in his hand. But that's now, and that was then. And if you look at Denis Rodman, from what comes out in the show, I mean, he was the only guy who didn't do drugs in his crew when he was young, because he was up all night practicing rebounds. I mean, who practices rebounds in the middle of the night? So have a look at what they're like at the formative stage, not so much during the success stage, because I mean, obviously Michael Jordan can have a beer after a game and still be great because he's put in all the effort. The problem is young athletes who think they can behave like that when they're in the formative stage developing and still become great, or as great as they would like with that kind of attitude. That's hard. So I think that's a thing well worth spending some time reflecting on. So that's the first thing. Let's talk about upbringing for a little bit, because I think the show does a great job showing maybe something a little bit counterintuitive, or at least not very well communicated. I mean, the road to the top, as we'll get back to, it's kind of rocky. Let's just start with family. I mean, Steve Kerr had a good upbringing, but then his father died. And he tells us that became a turning point for him, because then he dedicated himself more towards basketball. He got through the grief by dedicating himself more to basketball. And if you want to look this up, it's kind of cool. There's this article asking the questions, do orphans rule the world? If you have a look at people who have lost a parent, a lot of them are in leading positions today. Barack Obama, I think, is on that list. It's kind of cool, because when you look at and when you do the math, you'll see that a lot of the people who have gotten to their top, whatever field, has often faced difficulties. One of the kind of things you may find is that they've lost a parent. Let's look at Scottie Pippen. I mean, he described such a rough background with, I mean, they were poor, he had a ton of siblings, he had holes in his shoes, he was playing in his front yard with a worn out ball. And another tip, if you guys want to read something, is the talent code. This guy's traveled all around the world, had a look at, okay, how did they practice when they were young? I mean, the greats and some of the best environments for developing performers. What are they like? One thing you noticed is a lot of these places, for example, where the best sprinters in Jamaica practice and the best tennis players in Moscow, they were practicing in like worn out places. Not fancy, not modern at all. I mean, and that's one of the things he reflects on. Maybe that's good that you get into a training environment where it's more focused on what you're going to do and not all the fancy equipment. And maybe that makes you work harder. So that's an interesting book. Highly recommended. I also noticed in the show, these guys had a lot of older siblings. So I just did a little bit of searching online for articles, and sure enough, I mean, there's an article describing this, and elite athletes are more likely to be later born children. So we're starting to see a pattern here. They have faced difficulties because you will get challenged when you have older siblings, right? And I mean, it can be different things too, but the red line is adversity. And I mean, just to give another example, Tony Kukoc came from war. Eastern Europe, filled with war at the time, came from difficult surroundings and managed to come through. So just to sum this up, there's this article that I also recommend. It's an article called The Rocky Road to the Top. And here's how I would create a summary of the article. It's the fact that, okay, start with, in short, you need trauma. That's what they say. The talent needs trauma. So you have a challenge, and not always, but in many cases that will lead the athlete to refocus. Okay, I have to make an effort here because things are difficult. I have to do something. And if this goes well, you will come out in the other end a lot of the times with you have learned something, you've developed some skills. So in other words, the authors say maybe we try to make things a little bit too smooth sometimes. We tend to like to have smooth things, smooth sailing. We like to have discussions about how we can make it easy for them, the athletes. Maybe they need a challenge. Maybe they need adversity. I just want to add a caution here because these are the kinds of ideas that can be misinterpreted. For example, by a coach. You could run into your next session and say, oh, I'm going to challenge my athletes as much as possible here. And that might be a little bit dangerous. So they do state this as in the article. I mean, skills need to be taught, exercise supported. I mean, you need all these things if you want to give the athlete the best possible chance of having valuable learning and transferable benefits. If you look at, for example, when Michael Jordan was cut, how his mom supported him, gave him comfort, encouraged him to keep going. If you have support like that, it's easier. One thing they do not mention in this article that I would add is please make sure that you have a good relation with trust with your athlete. If you're a coach or a parent, make sure you have a level of trust before you start to challenge too much. That really helps too. And obviously, if you're an athlete yourself, I mean, try to seek out some support, try to learn some skills, and that maybe combined with the challenge can be really helpful. So, interesting stuff in my view. So let's just dive right into this guy in terms of commitment. I mean, I think it's very interesting to see how he has experienced all those things, adversity. And I mean, there's a few things that are obvious. I mean, his drive is amazing. I mean, he skipped vacation after they lost some game, can't remember which. He just told Tim Grover, his personal trainer, I'll see you in the morning. He skipped vacation, decided to work harder. And I mean, he's such a driven guy. And one thing that's interesting is he's very externally motivated. I'm pretty sure some of you noticed. He tends to play for a lot of external things. He loves the battle with other players. He would seek out these trash talk incidents. He would play for the kid in the crowd. So that's interesting. But he did experience a lot of setbacks along the way. I mean, you have his injuries. He got cut in high school, didn't make the varsity team. But one thing that really stuck with me was how he was brought up with his father and older brother, especially his one older brother, Larry, which probably, in my view, is the biggest source of his drive. And he tells you about this in some detail too. So I believe it's in the first episode. He would say he was competing a lot with his brother Larry, and Larry was better than him at a lot of things, including basketball. So Michael Jordan would say, "From a competitive standpoint, I would not be here without the confrontations with my brother. And I always felt like I was fighting Larry for my father's attention." And then one really interesting incident that his dad actually, he features in the show and tells us about this one incident where Michael wanted to join Larry and the father outside for some work. And his dad would just say, "Get back in the house with your mom. You're never gonna be anything." And I mean, maybe that's me being a psychologist, but my first reaction would be, wow, what are you saying? And even Michael Jordan say, when you're going through it, it's traumatic. I want that approval. So my determination got even greater to be as good or even better than my brother. And this is not an approach I would recommend anyone to talk to their kids like that. But I do see how that has created a drive in Michael Jordan that was kind of extreme. I don't think it's healthy for everyone, but he came through, and I do think that adversity will be part of a lot of top players' stories. So that was controversial, and I thought that was interesting in how he became the guy he became, as he's saying himself. So before I leave the topic of commitment, I want to touch on this one thing. It's always an interesting discussion, nature versus nurture. And it's always that, are you born with it? Are you not born with it, so you have to develop everything? Well, at least here in Norway, it's very popular to say it's all about nurture. It's all about developing and working hard, and then you'll become great. And I'm sure there are more than me who have heard that as an athlete. You just got to want it. You just got to work hard. I think the show makes a good job showing it's actually both. If you take a thing like how tall you are, take Scottie Pippen and Michael Jordan. They would come into training camp trying out when they were young, and the coaches would be like, meh, it's okay. But then, as they tell you in the show, when they started to grow, they had developed skills, they were not bad, and then they got taller and taller. I think Scottie Pippen grew like 5 inches in a short time, and same with Michael Jordan. Then it became explosive when they got tall, combined with all their skills, then they became great, spectacular. So I think that's important to keep in mind. These are big guys, these are big athletes, and it does matter in a sport like basketball. If you look at strength, physical training, from what they will tell you in the show, Michael Jordan did not prioritize strength training, working out in the gym, before they lost to, I think, Pistons in 1990. Then he became dedicated in the weight room. And look at how explosive he were before that. Even before that, with not too much strength training in his background. And of course, there is a genetic factor for such things. The last thing I would say is cognitive abilities, just from my field, has turned out to be a lot of things are hard to develop. I haven't tested Michael Jordan, obviously. I do see how he could have some cognitive abilities. We'll get into that more later, but a lot of his coaches has said, I mean, his awareness, ability to be attentive, focus under pressure, kind of amazing. And I do think it's a matter of having a little bit of the right genes. But of course, you have these things such as court awareness, decision making on the court, you have fundamentals. These are the things that are not part of your genetic disposition. And I do think another good thing about this show is this shows you how good coaching these guys have gotten over the years. Great coaching, contributions from a lot of people, in addition to a lot of hard work. And so I think that the show does a good job showing it's both. It's nature and nurture. I think that's such an important thing, that we don't say it's one or the other. Let's say it's both, and let's accept that, and let's focus on the things that we can affect, working with the genes that we have, the genetic material that we have in our athletes, and let's see what we can do with that. I think that's important. So I just want to finish the topic by asking this question: could MJ have gotten even better? And I mean, it's such an exciting thought, and it's so easy to say, oh, the best ones, they're perfect. But they're not, obviously. The obvious answer is yes, of course. And the nice thing about this show is that he'll have interviews telling you there were times when I was not as dedicated as I should have been. So even for commitment, he was not perfect. He admits there were times he could have been better in terms of commitment, dedication, and hard work. And just to leave with a thought, just so I'm not the guy who just says, yeah, he could have gotten better with no real examples, I just kept thinking of Curry. I'm not a basketball player or a big fan myself, but from what I've heard, Curry has sort of changed the game of basketball, or at least brought in this dimension of shooting from long distance. And he's like a new threat in terms of how he will be able to shoot from long distance. Michael Jordan does that in the show, in practice a few times, if you watch. He'll shoot from distance, like half joking, half serious. So I just kept thinking, if he would have been a little bit more dedicated, maybe, because he made a lot of those shots. I mean, could he have become Curry before Curry? I mean, if he would have spent more time working on things like that, maybe he could have developed these sides that we didn't see to the same extent as we do in Curry and other people. So I think it's an exciting thought. Maybe they could have gotten even better, because they always could. They're not perfect. I think that's exciting. I'm not going to spend any time almost talking about this. I think I'll leave that, because I mean, it's pretty obvious how he loves a challenge, how he deals with injuries. And this is such an interesting case during Corona now, where we can't practice fully, we can't do the things we would like to do. Have a look at the show and look at how they deal with things like getting an injury. And you'll see how, for example, Michael Jordan, Denis Rodman spends a lot of time outside of the gym, outside of the field, court, and they still develop. I mean, Denis Rodman watched game tapes, learned more about rebounds. Michael Jordan was working on the physical side. I mean, there's so many things that you can do. Even though you get presented with a challenge in terms of an injury or something that keeps you away from doing what you love, you can do something. And I think the show shows in a good way how he loves a challenge. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that. So let's dive into control, which is about taking responsibility. And again, I think there are some really good quotes here. My innate personality is to win at all costs. If I have to do it myself, I'm going to do it. I think that quote comes up a few times. And the reason, I mean, that's just a quote, but look at how he plays. And the reason why that's so impressive, at least to me, is that I see the polar opposite very often. And here's an image from my book. there's this case about the basketball player who has this kind of don't pass to me mentality. It's so easy to hide under pressure. It's so easy to not want the ball. It's so easy to think, oh, please don't pass to me. Let someone else take care of it. So I think it's so impressive how the greats, the really greats, take responsibility under pressure. So I guess the next question is, how can we make it easier for ourselves? And if we're working with athletes, how can we make it easier to get that kind of attitude? I'm taking charge. So the next question becomes, what are you going to focus on? Okay, you're going to focus, you're going to take responsibility. Let's say, what are you going to focus on? And that's where the control comes in. I think one of the key ingredients is the ability to be present. And that's another famous quote from this show. I mean, Michael was a mystic. He was always present. Maybe that's an exaggeration. I mean, he wasn't always present. Nobody's always present. But he had such an ability. Phil Jackson writes about this in his book, which I also recommend, 11 Rings. Such an ability to be aware. And maybe Phil Jackson helped him too, because one of the things that Phil Jackson did was have his whole team do mindfulness. If you're not familiar with mindfulness, it's very popular in high performance settings because it's different kinds of drills, focus drills that will challenge you to become more present. Even if it's just sitting still for 5 or 10 minutes, focusing on your breath. That's the kind of thing that Phil Jackson would have his players do before a game, before they would go in front of all these people to perform. So the ability to be present is key. And second, and this is probably the more complex part of my analysis here, is I want to just touch on how do they think in terms of task cues. Like when you're on the court, when you're playing sports, what should you focus on? What should go through your mind? So what to think about in a game situation. You have different things. I mean, when we all start to learn a skill, we tend to focus on what are we doing. Like when you learned how to ride a bike, the obvious example. You had to think, oh, what am I doing? And also, where are my parents? Because they were probably helping you. As you get better, you don't have to think as much about what you're doing in terms of a step-by-step control. You become more focused on, okay, where should I go on my bike? How should I ride my bike? And what kind of tempo and rhythm should I use? And if you look at the show, and when they zoom in on Michael or the other players during a game, I think it's very interesting to see one thing. It's very common in top level players. They tend to focus more on higher order concepts such as tactics. For example, okay, in that situation, let's do a switch. Like when he's sitting on the bench talking to Pippen. Okay, let's do that one on the next play. You tend to perform better if you focus more on the higher order concepts, if you're really good at something. If you try to focus too much on what you're doing in a very detailed way, like, okay, what's my elbow like? What's my knee angle like? It can become this thing that we call paralysis by analysis. So they do tend to focus on the tactics and the higher order concepts. But there's one exception, which is, the shot. So I just want to touch on that too, because when he shot the final shot, when he made that shot to win the last championship, he actually did focus on what he did. And I just want to take you through one thing, because if you're thinking about what you're doing, which you have to do sometimes if you're just, it's down to execution. I mean, Michael Jordan has dribbled up the court, he's in the shooting position, now he's going to shoot. Okay, let's just do a few options here. You can focus on your body or movement. That's usually called an internal focus. Or one thing that's gotten a lot of attention in the recent years, you can focus on movement consequence, external focus. And this may not mean something to you, I'll give you a few examples that will make this clear. Because there's a lot of accumulating research evidence on what tends to bring out the best performance. There's a study by Gabriel Wolf on guys doing a reach test. Jump as high as you can and touch a point as high as you can. Classical reach test that we do a lot in volleyball and basketball. And half the participants were asked to focus on touch as high as you can with your finger. And the other half were told, so in other words, that's focus on your body. The other half were told, try to focus on a point as high as you can. Reach to the highest point you can. In other words, focus on something outside of yourself, the consequence of you moving. External focus. And that seems like such a small thing, but people tend to jump higher with an external focus. Just to give a basketball example, free throw shooting. One group were told to focus on their wrist through the motion. The other half were told, focus on the rim. Don't care about your movement or your body, just focus on the rim. And not only tend Group B to perform better and hit more shots, they also had lower muscle activation measured by EMG, muscle measurement. So you get more for less. And that's another thing. If you want to perform and focus on execution, there's a lot of evidence suggesting you're probably well off. Try not to focus on step by step what you're doing. Try to focus on maybe the end point or a consequence of your movement. What Michael Jordan told was that he decided to go back to basic and do to the target. When he was shooting, he pointed 2 fingers towards the target, which apparently is kind of basic basketball shooting technique. But the nice thing is that brings him to the end point without analyzing each step of the way. So I wouldn't say it's external focus by any strict definition, but it's focusing on the end point and making sure that you get a good follow through without analyzing each step of the way. So I just wanted to touch on that because I thought it was interesting to hear him talk about how he ended up short on all his shots, he missed a lot of shots, and then he went back to basic with his focus. So that was interesting, I think. And finally, confidence. I think the show does a good job showing you it's context specific. People tend to say, he's such a confident person. He walks around with confidence. I think it's worth separating 2 things. First of all is general self-esteem versus confidence. You can be confident in one occasion doing one task and not very confident in another. Let's just look at, for example, when he's on the golf course, he's so much more filled with self-doubt. I mean, he has all these statements like, oh man, I can't putt today. I mean, my drive is off. When you see him in the basketball arena, he's a different guy. He's way more confident, talks in a way more offensive way, like more aggressive. Another thing is to separate swag, like being kind of cool, which is something else. I see a lot of athletes who tend to pretend that they're confident. I think if you look at some other guys in the show, they're very humble. And also Michael Jordan, as he was getting better and better as a young player, was very humble. So swag and that kind of coolness, if you will, I mean, that's something else. I think it's a good way of thinking. It's very context specific. And the last thing I'll say, how about those who play with Michael Jordan? How do they stay confident? Let's say if you're a guy like Kerr. I think it's very interesting. How do they get confident? And I think the beautiful moments in the show is when they get the opportunity and they succeed. Like when Kerr gets that important shot that he makes, he will tell, that was such a game changer for me. That was so important. From that moment on, I had way more confidence in myself. And I think it was the same with Paxton. Made an important shot. And that makes me think of how we tend to treat young, promising athletes who are doing well. They tend to get more time on the court. They tend to get more chances. If you're a really good player in volleyball, you tend to get more sets from the setter. You tend to get more passes if you're a football player or a basketball player. And the bad thing if you want to develop good players in the long term is that it's very hard to tell who's going to become the best players when they're growing old, when they're older. But it's not that hard to tell if you want players to play with confidence later on. They have to get chances and opportunities to perform. So I think that's an important takeaway from the show. Even if you're not Michael Jordan, you need chances and you can develop confidence to perform under pressure. And the last thing, for example, with this guy, he will tell you, yeah, I know I'm not Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen, but I do things that they won't do. And he had such a big strength in terms of his rebound play. He actually practiced rebounds, focused on rebounds. And the nice thing, if you focus on your strengths, like what's unique about you and your player, then they can go into any game and actually have a little bit of self-belief. Because you can always say, okay, there's something that I do well. I know so many coaches, when they get new players in, tend to focus on, okay, what's their biggest weakness that we can improve so they get better? But I think it's nice to start the other way around. Like, what is your strengths and what's going to be your style of play? And if you develop that thing, you tend to develop more confidence, and you can do like Rodman. You can go into a room or a court with maybe players that might be better than you overall, but you can do things that you do well. I think that's such an important takeaway too. So that's it. I mean, to summarize, I think Michael Jordan and the others fit into this model because they tended to be really high on these 4 C's. They had great commitment. We might discuss how healthy their upbringing was in terms of how maybe MJ got his drive. But I mean, there's no question, if you want to get to the top, you got to show commitment as MJ did, or at least in a way that gives you the chance to improve, because you probably need commitment if you want to improve to a certain level. You also need challenge, to embrace a challenge and maybe not see it as a threat, but more as an opportunity to grow. Try to develop an ability to take control under pressure, to stay focused and try to focus on the things that you can control, and try to develop a solid confidence based on your strengths, and take some chances and give yourself a chance to succeed under pressure and build on those experiences so you can be confident.